Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a bitterly cold night in medieval times, where the wind slips through the cracks of timber walls, and every breath turns to mist in the dim glow of a dying fire. There are no electric lights, no central heating, no comforting hum of modern life, only darkness, cold, and the slow passage of time that feels heavier than sleep itself. So settle in, relax, and let the quiet rhythm of the past carry you gently into this long, drifting story. The village lies silent beneath a pale winter sky, its narrow paths frozen into uneven ridges of ice and hardened mud. Small cottages huddle together as if for warmth, their thatched roofs dusted with a thin layer of snow that glows faintly under the moonlight. Smoke rises lazily from a few chimneys, though not all. Some fires have already gone out for the night, their occupants wrapped tightly in blankets, hopping to preserve what little warmth remains. Inside one such cottage, a man named Thomas shifts slightly beneath a rough wool covering. The blanket is coarse and scratchy, woven by hand months earlier, and though it traps some heat, it is far from comfortable. Beneath him, a mattress stuffed with straw rustles quietly each time he moves. The straw has flattened unevenly over time, forming ridges and hollows that press against his body in ways that make rest difficult. The fire in the hearth has burned low, reduced now to faintly glowing embers that pulse softly like a tired heartbeat. Thomas knows he should rise to tend it, to add another piece of firewood, but doing so means leaving the fragile warmth of his bed. The thought alone makes him hesitate. Outside, the wind brushes along the wooden walls, slipping through tiny gaps where the planks do not quite meet. It carries with it a dry, biting cold that seeps slowly into the room. There is no glass in the window, only a wooden shutter, latched tightly, yet still unable to keep the cold entirely at bay. At the far side of the cottage, his wife Margaret lies curled beside their young son. The child breathes softly, his small body wrapped in layers of cloth, his warmth shared with his mother in the only reliable way people of this time have through closeness. Margaret's arm rests protectively over him, though even in sleep, she shifts occasionally, adjusting to the creeping chill. Time moves differently here. Without clocks to measure the passing hours, the night stretches endlessly. The only markers are the fading fire, the shifting cold, and the occasional distant sound, perhaps a dog barking somewhere in the village, or the creak of wood as another house settles under the weight of frost. Thomas finally exhales and pushes himself upright. The cold greets him immediately, sharp and unwelcome. His bare feet touch the earthen floor, and he winces at the icy sensation that travels upward through his body. Each step toward the hearth feels deliberate, as though he must convince himself with every movement. He kneels beside the fire and stirs the embers with a simple iron rod. A faint glow brightens, and for a moment, there is hope. He adds a small piece of wood carefully chosen, because firewood is precious and must last through many nights. The flames catch slowly, reluctantly, licking along the edges before settling into a modest, flickering burn. The light dances across the walls, revealing the simplicity of the room. A wooden table, worn smooth by years of use. A few clay pots resting in the corner. A bundle of dried herbs hanging from a beam, their scent faint but comforting. Everything here has a purpose, and nothing is wasted. As the fire strengthens slightly, Thomas holds his hands toward it, absorbing what warmth he can. His fingers are rough and cracked from labor, the skin hardened by cold seasons and long days in the fields. Even now, in the depth of winter, there is work to be done, though tonight, the land itself sleeps beneath frost. He glances toward his family, watching the slow rise and fall of their breathing. There is a quiet reassurance in it, a reminder that despite the harshness of this life, they endure. Beyond the cottage, the village remains still. A narrow path leads toward a small chapel at the center, its wooden structure standing slightly taller than the surrounding homes. The chapel's door is closed, but inside, a single candle burns, a symbol of faith that persists even through the coldest nights. Further out, past the last row of cottages, the land opens into fields now barren and frozen. The soil is hard, unyielding, waiting for the distant promise of spring. A thin layer of snow stretches across the ground, broken only by the occasional track of an animal that has passed through in search of food. Back inside, Thomas adds another small log to the fire, then hesitates. Each piece of wood used now is one less for the nights to come. Winter is not yet over, and there is always the uncertainty of how long the cold will last. He returns slowly to the bed, slipping back beneath the rough blanket. The warmth he had before is mostly gone, replaced by a lingering chill that will take time to fade. Margaret stirs slightly as he settles, instinctively shifting closer. The fire crackles softly, a quiet companion in the darkness. Minutes or perhaps hours pass in a gentle blur. Sleep comes in fragments, broken by discomfort, by cold, by the occasional need to adjust or wake briefly before drifting off again. This is not the deep, uninterrupted rest of modern times, but something lighter, more fragile. At some point in the night, the wind grows stronger. It howls faintly as it moves through the village, pressing against doors and slipping through every weakness it can find. The cottage creaks in response, its wooden frame resisting the force. Thomas wakes again, his eyes opening to the dim glow of the fire, now reduced once more. He considers rising again, but hesitates, weighing the effort against the remaining warmth. Instead, he pulls the blanket tighter and closes his eyes. In the stillness, small sounds become more noticeable, the faint rustle of straw, the quiet breathing of his family, the soft crack of cooling wood. These are the sounds of survival, of a life lived close to the elements. Somewhere in the distance, a faint bell rings once. Perhaps it is the chapel, marking a moment in the night. Or perhaps it is something else carried by the wind. The sound fades quickly, leaving behind only silence once more. And so the night continues, slow and unhurried, stretching onward without urgency. As the hours pass, the cold deepens, settling into every corner of the cottage. Even the fire seems to struggle against it, its glow dimmer now, its warmth limited. Yet still, the small family remains, wrapped together in shared heat, enduring the long winter night as countless others have done before them. Eventually, far beyond the horizon, the first hint of dawn begins its quiet approach. But that is still some time away. The night lingers heavily over the village, as if reluctant to release its grip. Inside the cottage, the air has grown colder still, the kind of cold that settles deep into wood and bone alike. The fire has dimmed again, now only faint orange specks hidden beneath soft gray ash. Thomas lies awake without fully realizing it, drifting in that space between sleep and awareness. His body remains still, conserving warmth, while his mind floats quietly through half-formed thoughts. Margaret shifts slightly, pulling the child closer without waking. The boy murmurs softly in his sleep, his breath warm against her arm. Even in rest, there is a quiet vigilance in the way she holds him, a habit shaped by years of uncertainty. Nights like this are not unusual, yet each one carries its own quiet tension. The cold is never entirely predictable, and comfort is always temporary. A small gust of wind presses against the cottage wall, slipping through unseen cracks. It brushes across the room like an invisible tide, touching everything before fading again. The wooden beams creak softly in response, not in protest, but in acceptance. This is simply how things are here, where the boundary between shelter and nature is never absolute. Thomas opens his eyes once more, staring into the dim outline of the ceiling above. There is no clear sense of time, only the feeling that the night has been long and still has farther to go. He listens for a moment, hearing nothing beyond the familiar rhythm of quiet breathing and distant wind. It is a silence that feels full rather than empty. He considers the fire again, but remains where he is. The effort of rising feels greater now, his body heavier under the weight of cold and fatigue. Instead, he shifts slightly, pressing closer to the shared warmth beneath the blanket. It is not much, but it is enough to keep the edge of the cold at bay for a little longer. Outside, the village rests in deep stillness. A faint layer of frost has begun to thicken along the ground, creeping over pathways and wooden fences alike. The shapes of the cottages blur softly under the pale glow of the moon, their outlines softened by drifting mist. Nothing moves, and yet the entire landscape feels alive in its quiet way. Far beyond the cottages, the forest stands dark and motionless. Snow clings to its branches in delicate patterns, each tree holding its place like a silent witness. Occasionally, a branch releases its burden, sending a soft cascade of snow downward, the sound barely audible against the vast stillness. Back inside, the fire gives a faint crack, drawing Thomas's attention. For a moment, a small flame flickers to life, illuminating the room with a brief pulse of light. Shadows stretch and retreat along the walls, then settle once more as the flame fades again. It is a small reminder that warmth still exists, even if only in fragments. The boy stirs again, this time turning slightly. Margaret adjusts instinctively, her movements gentle and practiced. She does not fully wake, but her awareness never entirely disappears. The rhythm of care continues even in sleep, woven into every quiet motion. Time passes in slow, indistinct waves. There are no clear markers, no dividing lines between 1 hour and the next. Instead, the night unfolds as a continuous stretch of stillness, punctuated only by small, subtle changes. The cold deepens, then steadies, then deepens again. Thomas drifts back toward sleep, though it is never complete. Dreams come and go in fragments, blending with the faint awareness of his surroundings. In one moment, he is walking through a sunlit field from seasons past, the warmth vivid and real. In the next, he is aware once more of the chill pressing gently against him. The contrast is quiet but persistent, a reminder of how different life feels beyond winter. Yet those thoughts do not linger. The mind, like the body, conserves its energy, letting such images fade without resistance. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound rises, perhaps the shifting of an animal moving through the frozen fields. It is brief and indistinct, gone almost as soon as it appears. The village remains otherwise undisturbed, its people wrapped in their own small pockets of warmth and stillness. Inside the cottage, the embers continue their slow decline. The warmth they offer is minimal now, more suggestion than substance. And yet, even this faint heat makes a difference, softening the edge of the cold just enough to allow rest. Margaret exhales slowly, her breath steady and even. The boy's breathing follows a similar rhythm, the two sounds blending into one quiet pattern. It is a simple, grounding presence in the darkness, something constant in an otherwise uncertain night. Thomas shifts again, this time pulling the blanket higher. The fabric is rough against his skin, but its weight provides a small comfort. He closes his eyes once more, allowing the stillness to settle around him. Outside, the sky begins to change in the subtlest way. It is not yet light, not even close, but the darkness loses a fraction of its depth. The stars remain, though their brightness softens ever so slightly. It is a change so gradual it would go unnoticed without patience. The frost on the ground thickens further, forming delicate patterns along every surface. Wooden posts, thatched roofs, and narrow pathways all carry the quiet signature of the cold. The entire village seems held in a suspended moment, untouched and unmoving. Within the cottage, the temperature continues its slow descent. The warmth shared beneath the blanket becomes even more important now, each small movement affecting the fragile balance. Margaret draws the child closer still, and Thomas instinctively shifts nearer as well. There is no discussion, no conscious decision, only quiet adjustment. It is a rhythm learned over years, a silent understanding of how to endure nights like this. Every action is subtle, but each one matters. The fire, now nearly spent, emits one final faint glow before settling into darkness. The room dims further, lit only by the faintest hint of moonlight slipping through the edges of the shutter. Shadows blend together, soft and indistinct, and yet, despite the fading fire, the cottage does not feel entirely empty. There is still warmth here, still life, still a quiet sense of persistence. The cold may press in from every side, but it does not fully take hold. Thomas breathes slowly, his body finally beginning to settle into a deeper rest. The tension in his muscles eases slightly, replaced by a fragile sense of calm. It is not perfect comfort, but it is enough. Margaret remains still, her arm wrapped protectively around the child. The boy's breathing deepens, his small form relaxed in sleep. Together, they create a small center of warmth in the cold room. Outside, the sky continues its gradual shift, though dawn is still distant. The village remains silent, its people unaware of the slow passage of time beyond their walls. The night holds them gently, without urgency, and so the cold night stretches onward, quiet and unbroken, carrying this small family and the entire village. A faint grayness begins to gather at the very edge of the sky, so subtle that it feels more imagined than real. The night is not yet gone, but something within it has shifted. Inside the cottage, the darkness softens just enough to reveal faint shapes again, the outline of the table, the curve of the doorway, the still forms beneath the blanket. Thomas remains asleep now, his breathing slower, deeper than before, as if his body has finally surrendered to the quiet rhythm of the final hours before morning. Margaret stirs first, though she does not open her eyes immediately. There is a quiet awareness in her movement, a sense that something beyond the walls has changed. The cold is still there, sharp and constant, but it no longer feels as absolute as it did in the deepest part of the night. She shifts her arms slightly, adjusting around the child, making sure he remains covered. The habit is automatic, formed through countless nights, just like this one. The boy remains deeply asleep, untouched by the subtle changes around him. His small breaths come steadily, each one warm against the fabric near his face. Children, in their way, adapt differently to the cold, their sleep heavier, their awareness softer. For now, he rests without interruption, unaware of the long night that has nearly passed. Outside, the village slowly emerges from shadow. The frost that has settled over every surface now catches the faintest hint of early light, giving it a pale, almost silver appearance. The roofs, the fences, the narrow paths all carry this quiet sheen, as if the cold itself has left behind a visible trace. A distant sound breaks the silence, soft and uncertain at first. Somewhere, a wooden door shifts, perhaps nudged by the wind or opened briefly by someone beginning their day. It is followed by stillness again, but the moment has passed. The perfect silence of night has begun to unravel. Inside the cottage, Margaret opens her eyes at last. The dim light makes it easier to see, though everything remains muted and gray. She lies still for a moment, listening, measuring the quiet in a way that feels almost instinctive. There is no rush to move, no urgency yet. Morning in this world does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds slowly, asking patience. Thomas exhales deeply and shifts beside her, not fully awake, but no longer in deep sleep. His body senses the change as well, the gradual return of light, the subtle easing of the darkness. He does not rise yet. Instead, he remains where he is, letting the last moments of rest settle over him. The cold, however, has not retreated. If anything, it feels sharper now, as though it has reached its peak just before dawn. The absence of the fire's warmth is more noticeable in this fragile light. The air carries a stillness that feels almost brittle, as if even movement might disturb it. Margaret slowly lifts her head, glancing toward the hearth. The fire is completely out now, nothing left but pale ash and darkened wood. It will need to be rebuilt soon, but she waits a little longer. The effort of rising into the cold is never easy, and these last moments beneath the blanket are precious. Outside, the sky continues its gradual transformation. The gray deepens slightly, shifting toward a pale blue that hints at the coming day. The stars fade one by one, their light dissolving into the growing brightness. It is a quiet transition, almost imperceptible unless watched closely. From another part of the village, a faint sound of movement begins, a person stepping onto frozen ground, the soft crunch of frost beneath their feet. It is the first true sign of waking life beyond the cottages. One by one, others will follow, but for now, it remains a solitary presence in the distance. Inside, Thomas finally opens his eyes. He blinks slowly, adjusting to the dim light, then turns his head slightly toward Margaret. There is no need for words. They both understand the moment. The night has ended, and the day, with all its demands, is beginning. He pushes himself upright, the cold immediately wrapping around him like a sudden weight. His breath forms a faint cloud in the air, visible now in the early light. For a brief moment, he hesitates, gathering the will to move fully into the day. Margaret watches him quietly, then begins to shift as well. She gently adjusts the blanket around the child, ensuring he remains warm for as long as possible. The boy stirs faintly, but does not wake, his sleep lingering just a little longer. Thomas moves toward the hearth, his steps careful on the cold floor. The ashes shift softly as he kneels, his hands already reaching for the small pieces of wood set aside for the morning. Starting a new fire is always more difficult than maintaining one, especially after a night like this. He arranges the wood slowly, deliberately, his fingers stiff from the cold. Each movement is practiced, repeated countless times before. There is a quiet patience in the process, an understanding that the fire cannot be rushed. Margaret sits up now, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The air feels sharper outside its cover, but she adjusts quickly. Her eyes move around the room, taking in the small details, measuring what needs to be done. The first faint spark catches in the hearth, barely visible at first. Thomas leans closer, shielding it with his hands, coaxing it gently. For a moment, it seems uncertain, flickering weakly, but then it begins to grow. A thin flame emerges, small but steady. The light from the flame spreads softly across the room, bringing with it the first true warmth of the new day. It is not strong yet, but it is enough to begin pushing back the cold that has settled overnight. Outside, the village continues its slow awakening. Another door opens, then closes. A distant voice carries briefly through the air before fading again. The stillness is breaking, piece by piece, as life begins to return. Inside the cottage, the small flame grows gradually, feeding on the carefully placed wood. The warmth it produces is modest, but it changes the feel of the room almost immediately. The cold no longer feels absolute. It has something to resist it. Margaret rises at last, moving quietly so as not to wake the child. Her feet touch the cold floor, and she pauses briefly, adjusting to the sensation before taking a step forward. The day has begun, whether they are ready or not. Thomas remains by the fire, watching it carefully, ensuring it continues to grow. His hands hover near the flame, absorbing what warmth they can. The light flickers across his face, softening the tired lines there. The boy shifts again, closer now to waking. The change in light, the subtle sounds of movement, all begin to reach him even in sleep. It will not be long before he opens his eyes and joins the day. Outside, the sky has turned a pale, washed blue. The sun itself has not yet appeared, but its presence is felt in the growing brightness. The frost glimmers faintly, reflecting the early light in quiet patterns, and so the long, cold night finally gives way, not suddenly, but slowly, gently carrying this small family from darkness into the fragile beginning of another winter day. The pale morning light continues to spread quietly across the village, touching each surface with a soft, colorless glow. Inside the cottage, the small fire begins to settle into a steady rhythm, its flames rising a little higher as the wood catches more fully. The warmth it gives is still modest, but after the long night, even this slight comfort feels significant. Thomas remains kneeling beside the hearth, watching carefully as if the fire itself requires his full attention to survive. Margaret moves slowly across the room, her body still adjusting to the cold that lingers despite the growing light. Each step on the hardened floor is deliberate, her movements measured and calm. She reaches for a small clay pot resting on the table, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. There is no rush in her actions, only a steady beginning to the tasks that will shape the day. The child stirs once more beneath the blanket, his sleep gradually loosening its hold. A faint sound escapes him, something between a sigh and a murmur, as he shifts onto his side. The warmth that had been shared through the night is beginning to fade, replaced by the cooler air of morning. Even so, he clings to sleep a little longer, unaware of the quiet activity unfolding around him. Outside, the village grows more active in small, scattered ways. A figure crosses a narrow path, their steps slow against the frost-covered ground. Another cottage releases a thin line of smoke into the morning air, the signal of a fire being lit within. These signs of life appear one by one, never all at once, as if the entire village wakes in a gentle sequence rather than a single moment. Thomas reaches forward and adjusts a piece of wood in the fire, nudging it slightly so the flame can take hold more evenly. The fire responds with a soft crackle, its light flickering across his hands. He leans back slightly, satisfied for now, though his attention never fully leaves it. Fire is more than comfort here. It is necessity, survival, and without it, the day would begin much differently. Margaret pours a small amount of water into the clay pot and brings it closer to the fire. The water is cold, drawn earlier and left overnight, and it will take time to warm. She places the pot carefully, ensuring it will not tip, then steps back, wrapping her arms loosely around herself as she waits. The simple act of warming water feels like the first true step into the day. The boy finally opens his eyes, blinking slowly at the unfamiliar brightness. For a moment, he remains still, as if unsure where he is. Then recognition settles in. He shifts beneath the blanket, peeking out from its edge, his gaze moving toward the faint glow of the fire. The warmth draws him, even from across the room. Margaret notices immediately and offers a quiet, reassuring glance. There are no words, only a small gesture of acknowledgement. She moves back toward him, adjusting the blanket once more before gently guiding him to sit up. The air greets him with a chill that makes him pull the fabric closer around his shoulders. Thomas rises at last, his joints stiff from the cold and the night's uneven rest. He stretches slightly, then moves toward the table, his movements slow but purposeful. The day's work is already forming in his mind, though it remains unspoken. There will be tasks to complete, supplies to manage, and the constant awareness of the season's demands. Outside, the light strengthens further, revealing more detail in the landscape. The frost that once seemed smooth now shows its texture, tiny crystals clinging to wood and earth alike. The paths between cottages begin to show faint marks where others have walked, each step leaving an imprint that lingers in the cold. From the direction of the chapel, a bell sounds once, low and steady. It carries across the village, not loud but clear enough to be heard within the cottages. The sound is familiar, marking the passage from night into morning, a quiet signal that the day has begun for all. Inside, the water in the pot begins to show the first signs of warmth. A faint wisp of steam rises, barely visible in the cool air. Margaret watches it closely, knowing it will take time before it is ready. Patience is woven into every part of this life, especially in moments like these. The boy slips from the bed, his feet touching the cold floor with a small, startled reaction. He hesitates, then quickly moves closer to the fire, drawn by its warmth. He sits near the hearth, his hands extended toward the flames, mimicking the movements he has seen countless times before. Thomas glances at him briefly, a quiet recognition passing between them. There is no need for instruction. The rhythm of these mornings is learned through observation, through repetition. Even at a young age, the patterns of survival begin to take shape. Margaret moves about the room, gathering a few simple items: cloth, a wooden spoon, a small piece of stored food. Each object has its place, its purpose, and she handles them with care. Nothing here is wasted, and everything contributes in some small way to the day ahead. Outside, more villagers begin to appear, their figures moving slowly through the pale light. Some carry small bundles of wood, others simply step out to observe the morning. There is little conversation at first, only quiet acknowledgement, as each person adjusts to the cold and the return of light. The fire inside the cottage grows stronger now, its warmth spreading more evenly through the space. The difference is subtle but noticeable, softening the sharp edge of the cold that lingered from the night. The room begins to feel less like a place of endurance and more like a place of living. Margaret lifts the pot carefully, testing its warmth, then sets it back down. It is not yet ready, but it will be soon. She moves toward the doorway, placing a hand lightly against it, as if considering whether to open it. The outside air will be colder still, but the day waits beyond it. Thomas steps beside her, his presence steady and calm. He looks toward the door, then back at the room, as if measuring the moment. There is always a brief pause before stepping into the day, a quiet transition between the safety of the interior and the demands beyond. The boy watches them both, his eyes moving between the fire and the door. The warmth at his back contrasts with the unseen cold outside, creating a small but meaningful choice, even if he does not fully understand it yet. Margaret finally lifts the latch, opening the door just slightly. A sharp breath of cold air enters immediately, carrying with it the crisp scent of frost and earth. The light outside is brighter now, clearer, and it spills gently into the room. She pauses there, holding the door, allowing the moment to settle. The village beyond is waking fully now, its quiet life unfolding in the pale winter morning. Behind her, the fire continues to burn, steady and reliable. And so, with the night fully behind them, and the day beginning to take shape, this small family stands at the threshold between warmth and cold, rest and work. The cold air from outside lingers in the doorway for a moment before slowly blending with the warmth of the fire. Margaret keeps the door only slightly open, as if testing the morning rather than fully stepping into it. The pale light spreads further across the floor, revealing every uneven mark in the hardened earth. Thomas stands beside her, his gaze moving outward, quietly observing the village as it wakes. There is no urgency yet, only a steady acceptance that the day has begun. Margaret closes the door again after a brief pause, sealing the warmth back inside. The shift is immediate. The cold retreats just enough to make the room feel sheltered once more. She turns back toward the fire, her movements calm and familiar, as if following a pattern repeated countless times before. The boy watches her closely, his small hands still stretched toward the flames. The flickering light reflects in his eyes, holding his attention in a quiet, almost thoughtful way. Thomas moves toward the corner of the room where a few tools rest against the wall. Each one shows signs of long use, wood smoothed by handling, metal worn dull but reliable. He picks up one of them, weighing it briefly in his hand, as though considering the tasks ahead. Winter work is different from other seasons, slower in some ways, but no less important. There are repairs to be made, supplies to be checked, and always the need to prepare for what may come. Margaret returns to the clay pot, lifting it carefully from near the fire. A thin stream of steam rises more clearly now, drifting into the air before fatting. She pours a small amount into a simple wooden cup, then sets it aside to cool slightly. Warm water is a small comfort, but in a morning like this, it feels significant. She gestures gently to the boy, offering it to him once it is ready. The child takes the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth against his fingers. He brings it close, sipping slowly, the heat spreading through him in a way that makes him pause. His expression softens, though he says nothing. These quiet moments, small as they are, carry a kind of quiet relief that words are not needed to express. Outside, more movement gathers in the village. A pair of figures pass along the narrow path, their breath visible in the cold air. One carries a bundle of sticks, likely gathered earlier and stored for mornings like this. The other walks with empty hands, perhaps heading toward a shared task, or simply beginning the day's routine. Their steps are steady, leaving faint impressions in the frost. Thomas glances toward the shuttered window, listening to the subtle sounds beyond the walls. There is a rhythm to it now, the occasional footstep, the distant creak of wood, the faint murmur of voices carried lightly through the cold air. The village is no longer silent, though it remains quiet in a way that feels unhurried. Margaret begins arranging a small portion of food on the table, her movements careful and precise. There is little to spare, and each piece is handled with thought. The meal is simple, as most are, but it serves its purpose. She places the items within easy reach, creating a small center of activity in the otherwise sparse room. The boy finishes his drink and sets the cup down with a soft, deliberate motion. He watches as Margaret prepares the food, his attention shifting from one action to another. There is a sense of learning in his gaze, a quiet absorption of the patterns that define their life. Even without instruction, these moments begin to shape his understanding. Thomas sets the tool back against the wall, deciding to wait a little longer before stepping outside. The warmth of the fire has begun to spread more evenly now, making the room feel almost comfortable by comparison to the night before. He moves closer to the hearth, extending his hands once again, letting the heat settle into his skin. Outside, the light continues to strengthen, revealing more detail with each passing moment. The frost begins to lose its sharp edge, softening slightly as the temperature shifts. The village, once muted and gray, takes on faint tones of brown and pale gold, though still subdued under the winter sky. From the direction of the chapel, another bell sounds, this time more distinct, marking a later point in the morning. It carries across the village with a calm, steady tone, reminding all who hear it that the day is moving forward. The sound lingers briefly, then fades into the background of quiet activity. Margaret sits at the table, her posture relaxed but attentive. She gestures for Thomas and the boy to join her, creating a small shared moment before the day fully begins. They gather without words, each taking their place in a quiet routine that feels both ordinary and essential. The food is simple, eaten slowly, each bite measured. There is no rush, only the steady rhythm of eating and breathing and existing within this small space. The fire crackles softly beside them, its presence constant and reassuring. The boy glances occasionally toward the door, his curiosity drawn to the world beyond. The light slipping through its edges suggests movement and possibility, even if it is cold and uncertain. He shifts slightly in his seat, as if preparing himself for what comes next. Thomas notices and gives a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what lies ahead. Soon, they will step outside into the crisp air and the demands of the day. But for now, they remain within the warmth, allowing these last moments of quiet to settle around them. Margaret gathers the cups once they are finished, setting them aside with care. Every item has its place, and each action flows naturally into the next. The room feels more alive now, filled not just with warmth, but with purpose. Outside, the village is fully awake. More figures move along the paths, their presence forming a quiet network of activity. Smoke rises steadily from multiple chimneys, blending into the pale sky. The stillness of night has been replaced by a gentle, continuous motion. Thomas stands and moves toward the door once more, his posture firm now, ready. He reaches for the latch, pausing briefly as if to gather his thoughts. The warmth behind him contrasts sharply with the cold waiting outside. But the choice is no longer in question. Margaret watches him, then turns to the boy, adjusting his clothing with careful hands. She ensures he is covered as well as possible, preparing him for the chill beyond the walls. The boy remains still, accepting the small adjustments with quiet patience. Thomas opens the door again, this time wider. The cold air enters more fully, sharp, and immediate, carrying the sounds of the village with it. The light follows, brighter now, filling the room with a pale clarity. He steps just beyond the threshold, his boots pressing into the frost-covered ground. The cold is immediate, but he does not hesitate. Behind him, Margaret and the boy move closer, ready to follow. For a brief moment, they stand together at the edge of the cottage, between warmth and cold, stillness and motion. Then, without words, they step forward into the morning, joining the quiet life of the village as it unfolds around them. The cold greets them fully as they step outside, wrapping around their bodies in a sharp, steady way that feels almost alive. The air is crisp and clear, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and frozen earth. Thomas pauses just beyond the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness of morning. The ground beneath his boots crunches softly, each step pressing into the thin layer of frost that covers the village paths. Behind him, Margaret and the boy follow, staying close for warmth and reassurance. The cottage door closes with a quiet thud, sealing in the last traces of indoor warmth. Outside, the world feels larger, more open, and far less forgiving. The narrow path stretches ahead, marked by footprints left by early risers. Each impression in the frost tells a small story of movement, someone carrying wood, someone heading toward the chapel, someone beginning their work before the sun fully rises. These signs of life are subtle, but they form a quiet pattern across the village. Margaret pulls her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath forming a soft cloud in the air with each exhale. The boy mimics her instinctively, wrapping his arms close to his body as he looks around. His eyes take in everything: the pale sky, the thin smoke rising from chimneys, the distant figures moving slowly between cottages. It is a familiar scene, yet each morning feels slightly different, shaped by the cold and the quiet rhythm of winter. Thomas begins to walk, his pace steady but unhurried. The path beneath him is uneven, hardened by frost and worn by use. He moves carefully, aware that a misstep on the icy ground could easily lead to a fall. Margaret and the boy follow closely behind, their footsteps falling into the same narrow trail he creates. As they pass another cottage, a door opens, and a neighbor steps out, pausing briefly in the cold air. There is a small exchange of glances, no words, just a simple acknowledgement. In this place, such gestures are enough. Everyone understands the morning, the cold, and the quiet work that lies ahead. The village center slowly comes into view, marked by the small chapel standing slightly apart from the surrounding homes. Its wooden structure catches the early light, its surface pale and still. A few figures move nearby, their presence calm and purposeful. The bell that rang earlier seems to linger in memory, guiding the rhythm of the morning even after its sound has faded. Margaret glances toward the chapel, but does not change direction. There are other tasks waiting, and time must be used carefully. She adjusts her pace slightly to keep close to Thomas, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. The simple contact offers both guidance and warmth. The boy looks down at the ground as he walks, watching his feet press into the frost. Each step leaves a mark, and for a moment, he focuses on placing his feet exactly where Thomas has stepped before him. It becomes a quiet game, a way to pass the time and distract from the cold. The air remains still, with only the faintest breeze moving through the village. When it does, it carries a sharper chill, brushing against exposed skin and finding its way through layers of clothing. Margaret lowers her head slightly against it, her expression calm but alert. Thomas reaches a small stack of wood near the edge of the path, partially covered with a thin layer of frost. He stops and bends down, examining it briefly. Each piece is important, and nothing can be taken lightly. He selects a few pieces, testing their dryness, then gathers them into his arms. Margaret waits beside him, shifting her weight from one foot to the other to keep warm. The boy watches closely, his attention fixed on the careful way Thomas chooses each piece of wood. There is a quiet lesson in the action, one that does not need explanation. With the wood gathered, Thomas straightens and resumes walking. The added weight changes his pace slightly, but his steps remain steady. Margaret and the boy fall back into rhythm behind him, their movement smooth and practiced. The path leads them toward a small open area where others have begun similar tasks. A man nearby splits a piece of wood with slow, deliberate strikes, each movement measured to conserve energy. Another figure kneels near a small fire, coaxing it to life with careful breaths. These scenes unfold quietly, without urgency, each person focused on their own work. Thomas sets the wood down near a designated spot, arranging it with care. He takes a moment to adjust the stack, ensuring it remains stable and protected from moisture. Margaret watches briefly, then turns her attention to the boy, brushing a small patch of frost from his sleeve. The boy looks up at her, then back at the surrounding activity. There is a sense of quiet curiosity in his gaze, a growing awareness of how each person contributes to the life of the village. Even in the cold, there is movement, purpose, and connection. A faint warmth begins to spread through the air as the sun edges closer to the horizon. It is not enough to counter the cold fully, but it changes the light, giving it a slightly golden tone. The frost reflects this shift, shimmering softly before beginning its slow retreat. Thomas rubs his hands together, the friction bringing a small return of warmth. He looks around, assessing what needs to be done next. There is no list, no spoken plan, but the tasks arrange themselves in his mind through experience. Margaret steps a little closer to him, her presence steady and reassuring. The boy stands between them, his small figure framed by their movements. For a moment, they pause together, a brief stillness within the larger flow of the village. Nearby, a voice rises softly as two villagers exchange a few words. The sound is quiet, almost muted by the cold air, but it carries a sense of shared understanding. Conversations here are brief, practical, shaped by necessity rather than leisure. The sun finally begins to appear, just touching the edge of the sky. Its light spreads slowly, casting long shadows across the ground. The village takes on a new clarity, each detail more defined, each movement more visible. The frost on the path begins to soften under the growing light, though it still holds firm in shaded areas. The air remains cold, but there is a subtle shift, a promise that the day will bring at least a slight easing of the night's intensity. Thomas picks up another piece of wood and moves toward a nearby structure where it will be used. Margaret follows, guiding the boy along the path. Their steps remain careful, but there is a steadiness now, a rhythm fully established. The village continues its quiet awakening around them, each person contributing in small, necessary ways. Smoke rises higher, footsteps become more frequent, and the soft murmur of activity replaces the deep silence of night. And so, beneath the pale winter sun, the cold morning unfolds steadily, carrying Thomas, Margaret, and their child into the quiet work of the day, where each moment builds upon the last. The pale sunlight continues to stretch across the village, slowly warming the surfaces it touches, though the cold still lingers stubbornly in the air. Thomas moves with steady purpose, carrying another armful of wood toward the small structure where it will be stored. His breath rises in slow, visible clouds, fatting almost instantly into the crisp morning. Behind him, Margaret and the boy follow at a measured pace, their steps careful on the still frozen ground. The open space where several villagers have gathered now feels more active, though the movements remain calm and unhurried. A man lifts his axe again, bringing it down with controlled force against a log, the sound echoing softly through the cold air. Nearby, another person adjusts a bundle of sticks, arranging them neatly to keep them dry. These small, repeated actions form the quiet rhythm of the morning, each one contributing to the village's survival. Thomas sets the wood down and pauses, straightening his back slightly as he looks around. The light has grown stronger now, revealing more faces, more movement, more signs of life. Yet, despite this, there is still a kind of silence. No loud voices, no rush, only the steady continuation of tasks that must be done. Margaret kneels briefly beside the boy, adjusting the edge of his clothing once more. The cold finds its way into every small gap, and these constant, careful corrections are necessary. The boy stands still, watching the others nearby, his attention shifting between the rising smoke, the splitting wood, and the faint glow of small fires beginning to take hold. A thin breeze moves through the area, carrying with it a sharper chill that cuts through the layers of warmth. Thomas turns slightly into it, his expression unchanged, as if accustomed to such moments. Margaret lowers her head again, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, guiding him closer. The sun rises a little higher, its light now reaching the tops of the cottages more fully. The frost there begins to melt in tiny, almost invisible drops, slipping quietly from the thatch. In shaded areas, however, the cold holds firm, preserving the frozen patterns across the ground and wood. Thomas steps toward a nearby pile of logs, selecting one and placing it carefully on a splitting block. He grips the axe, lifting it slowly before bringing it down in a measured strike. The sound is firm, but not harsh, echoing just enough to be heard without breaking the calm of the morning. The boy watches closely, his eyes following each movement with quiet concentration. There is something steady and almost rhythmic in the action, something that draws his attention without overwhelming it. He shifts his weight slightly, standing a little closer, as if trying to understand each part of the process. Margaret rises and moves a few steps away, gathering smaller pieces of wood that have been set aside. Her hands move quickly but carefully, arranging them into a bundle that can be carried easily. Each piece is chosen with thought, nothing taken without purpose. Around them, other villagers continue their work, forming a loose pattern of movement across the open space. Some speak briefly, their voices low and practical, while others remain silent, focused on their tasks. There is a sense of shared understanding here, a quiet agreement shaped by necessity rather than words. Thomas pauses after a few strikes, setting the axe aside for a moment to rest his hands. The cold makes every movement more demanding, and even simple actions require careful packing. He exhales slowly, watching the faint cloud of his breath drift away. Margaret returns with the bundle of smaller wood, placing it near the growing stack. She glances toward Thomas, then toward the boy, her expression calm and attentive. There is no need to speak. Each of them understands what must be done. The boy kneels near the smaller pieces, picking one up and turning it in his hands. It is light, dry, and rough against his skin. He studies it for a moment, then places it carefully with the others, mimicking the quiet precision he has seen around him. The sun continues its slow climb, bringing a slightly warmer tone to the light. The difference is subtle, but it changes the feel of the air just enough to be noticed. The sharp edge of the cold softens slightly, though it remains ever present, A faint sound of footsteps approaches from the path, and another villager joins the gathering. There is a brief exchange of nods, a quiet acknowledgement, before the newcomer begins their own task. The flow of activity continues, uninterrupted and steady. Thomas resumes his work, lifting the axe once more. Each strike follows the last with careful consistency, splitting the wood into manageable pieces. The rhythm becomes almost meditative, a steady pattern that blends into the broader sounds of the village. Margaret adjusts the bundle again, tightening it so it can be carried back later. She takes a moment to straighten, looking out across the village. The scene is calm, grounded, shaped by routine and repetition. The boy stands and steps closer to her, his gaze moving between her and Thomas. There is a quiet sense of belonging in his posture, as if he is beginning to understand his place within this small world. A faint drip of melting frost begins to appear along the edge of a nearby roof, the sound soft but distinct against the stillness. It marks the slow change in temperature, the gradual shift from night to day. Thomas finishes another log and sets the pieces aside, his movements slowing slightly as he takes a brief pause. He looks toward the sky, noting the position of the sun, measuring the time not by clocks, but by light and shadow. Margaret lifts the bundle of smaller wood, testing its weight before adjusting her grip. She nods slightly toward Thomas, a quiet signal that she is ready to return to the cottage when needed. The boy watches her, then looks back toward the fire in the open space, its flames now steady and bright. The warmth it offers draws him for a moment, and he steps closer, holding his hands out again. Around them, the village continues to settle into its daytime rhythm. More people move along the paths, more smoke rises into the sky, and the sounds of quiet work become more frequent. Thomas picks up the remaining pieces of wood and gathers them together, preparing to carry them back. His movements are steady, shaped by habit and necessity. Margaret waits beside him, the bundle held securely in her arms. For a brief moment, they stand together again, the boy between them, the morning fully formed around them. The cold remains, but it no longer feels as overwhelming as it did before dawn. Then, without hesitation, they begin to walk back along the path toward their cottage, their steps leaving fresh marks in the softening frost. The path back toward the cottage feels slightly different now, marked by the faint softening of frost beneath their feet. Each step still carries a quiet crunch, but there is a hint of give in the ground that was absent earlier. Thomas walks ahead with the gathered wood balanced in his arms, his posture steady despite the weight. Margaret follows closely, her bundle held securely, while the boy keeps pace between them, careful not to stray from the narrow trail. The village behind them continues its gentle rhythm, the sounds of work fading gradually as they move away. A distant strike of wood against wood echoes faintly, then disappears into the open air. Smoke rises steadily from the chimneys, forming thin, wavering lines that drift upward before dissolving. The morning feels more alive now, though it remains quiet in its own restrained way. As they approach their cottage, the familiar shape comes into clearer view. The thatched roof glistens slightly where the frost has begun to melt, small droplets catching the pale sunlight before slipping away. The wooden walls stand unchanged, worn but solid, holding their place against the cold. Thomas reaches the door first and pauses briefly, shifting the wood in his arms to free one hand. He lifts the latch and pushes the door open, allowing a wave of cooler indoor air to meet the colder air outside. The difference is subtle but noticeable, a reminder of the fragile warmth they had left behind. Margaret steps inside after him, her movements careful as she crosses the threshold. The boy follows quickly, eager to return to the presence of the fire. The door closes behind them with a soft, familiar sound, sealing out the open air and restoring a sense of enclosure. Inside, the fire has settled into a steady burn, its flames rising more confidently than before. The room feels warmer than when they left, though still far from comfortable by any modern measure. The light from the doorway fades as it closes, replaced by the softer glow of the hearth. Thomas sets the wood down near the fire, arranging it carefully so that it will be easy to use throughout the day. Each piece is placed with thought, ensuring that none are wasted or damaged. Margaret moves toward the table, setting her bundle beside the smaller pieces already gathered. The boy goes directly to the hearth, kneeling near the flames with a quiet sense of relief. He stretches his hands toward the warmth, his fingers slowly relaxing after the cold outside. The fire crackles softly, responding to the addition of new wood with a gentle increase in heat. Margaret removes her shawl slightly, loosening it around her shoulders as the warmth begins to settle in. She glances around the room, noting what needs to be done next. The day is still early, and there is much to prepare before the light begins to fade again. Thomas adds another piece of wood to the fire, watching as the flames catch and grow stronger. The light flickers across the walls, bringing a sense of quiet movement to the otherwise still space. He leans back slightly, satisfied that the fire will hold for now. Outside, the village continues its steady activity, though the sounds are muted by the walls of the cottage. Occasionally, a faint voice or distant movement can be heard, but it blends easily into the background. Inside, the focus remains on warmth, shelter, and the small tasks at hand. Margaret begins to sort through the items on the table, her hands moving with practiced ease. She adjusts a piece of cloth, sets aside a small tool, and checks the contents of a clay container. Each action is deliberate, part of a routine that keeps the household functioning. The boy watches the fire for a moment longer, then turns his attention to Margaret. He moves closer, observing her work with quiet curiosity. His presence is calm, his movements slow, as if absorbing each detail without needing to ask questions. Thomas steps toward the doorway again, placing his hand briefly against the wood, as if testing the cold beyond it. He does not open it this time, instead turning back toward the room. There is comfort in remaining inside a little longer, allowing the warmth to build before facing the outside again. Margaret pours a small amount of water into the pot once more, placing it near the fire to warm. The steam rises more quickly this time, the heat stronger now that the flames are steady. She watches it for a moment, then steps back, letting the process continue on its own. The boy sits near the hearth, his posture relaxed, his attention shifting between the fire and the quiet movements around him. The warmth has softened the tension in his small frame, replacing it with a sense of ease. Thomas moves to the corner where the tools are kept, selecting one and examining it briefly. He runs his hand along its surface, checking for wear, ensuring it remains usable. Maintenance is as important as use, especially in a place where replacements are not easily found. Margaret glances toward him, then back to her work, her expression steady and focused. The rhythm of the morning has settled fully now, each of them moving within it without hesitation. Outside, the sun rises higher, its light growing stronger, though still pale against the winter sky. The frost continues to melt slowly, revealing the darker earth beneath. The village paths become slightly clearer, the footprints more defined. Inside, the warmth builds gradually, filling the small space with a steady, comforting heat. The fire remains the center of it all, its presence constant and reliable. The crackle of burning wood becomes a quiet companion to the day's work. The boy leans slightly closer to the fire, then pulls back just enough to remain comfortable. He watches the flames move, their shapes changing constantly, holding his attention in a simple, steady way. Thomas sets the tool back in its place and moves toward the table, joining Margaret. He looks over the items she has arranged, nodding slightly as if confirming what must be done next. There is no need for discussion. The tasks are understood. Margaret lifts the warmed water and pours it carefully, preparing for the next part of the morning routine. Her movements remain calm and controlled, shaped by experience and necessity. The boy rises slowly and steps closer, watching as the water is handled. The warmth in the room contrasts with the memory of the cold outside, creating a quiet sense of balance. Thomas glances once more toward the door, then back to his family. The day is fully underway now, and soon they will need to step outside again. But for this moment, they remain within the safety of the cottage, allowing the warmth to settle deeply. Outside, the village continues its quiet work, each person contributing in small, steady ways. Inside, the same rhythm continues, just on a smaller scale, contained within the wooden walls. And so, As the winter morning unfolds further, the cottage becomes a place of quiet preparation and steady movement, carrying Thomas, Margaret, and the boy gently forward into the rest of the day. The warmth inside the cottage deepens gradually, settling into the wooden walls and the packed earth floor as the fire continues to burn steadily. The contrast with the outside world grows more noticeable now, creating a quiet sense of refuge within the small space. Thomas stands near the table, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if measuring the flow of the morning. Margaret continues her careful movements, each task unfolding naturally into the next. The boy remains close to the hearth, drawn again and again to the steady comfort of the flames. A faint knocking sound echoes somewhere in the distance, perhaps a tool striking wood or a door closing against the cold. It reaches them only as a soft reminder that the village continues beyond their walls. Inside, however, the rhythm is slower, more contained, shaped by the boundaries of the cottage and the needs of the moment. Margaret lifts a folded piece of cloth and shakes it gently, releasing a few tiny flecks of dust that catch the light before disappearing. She lays it neatly across the table, smoothing it with her hands. Every movement has a purpose, even the smallest ones, contributing to a sense of order that helps carry them through the day. Thomas reaches for a small wooden container, opening it to check its contents. He pauses for a moment, considering what remains, then closes it again with a quiet motion. There is always a balance to maintain, always the need to think ahead, even in simple actions. The boy shifts his position, turning slightly so that he can see both the fire and the table at once. His eyes move from one to the other, following the small details of each action. He does not speak, but his attention is steady, absorbing everything around him. The fire crackles softly, sending a brief shower of tiny sparks upward before they fade into nothing. The sound is gentle, almost soothing, blending with the quiet movements of the room. The warmth it provides now reaches further, touching every corner of the cottage. Margaret moves toward the hearth, adjusting one of the logs slightly to keep the flame even. She watches for a moment to ensure it holds, then steps back. The fire responds with a steady glow, its light flickering across her face before settling again. Thomas walks slowly toward the doorway once more, placing his hand against it as he had before. This time, he lingers a little longer, as if listening to something beyond the wood. The sounds outside are faint, but present, carried through the small gaps in the structure. He opens the door just enough to let in a narrow stream of light and air. The cold slips inside again, sharp but brief, before he closes it once more. The exchange is quick, controlled, a small reminder of the world waiting beyond. Margaret glances toward him, then returns to her work, her movements unchanged. The routine continues, steady and unbroken, even with the brief interruption. The boy watches the door for a moment, then shifts his attention back to the fire. Outside, the sun climbs higher, its light growing stronger across the village. The frost recedes further, leaving behind damp patches that darken the ground. The air remains cold, but the sharpest edge has softened slightly. Inside, the room feels more settled now, the warmth holding steady. The initial chill of the morning has faded, replaced by a quiet comfort that makes movement easier. Thomas steps away from the door and returns to the table, his expression calm. Margaret lifts the pot once more, testing the warmth of the water before setting it aside. A thin trail of steam rises and disappears into the air, marking the steady presence of heat. She arranges a few more items, preparing for what comes next. The boy stands and moves closer to the table, drawn by the activity there. He watches Margaret's hands as they move, his gaze following each motion with quiet focus. There is a sense of learning in the way he observes, even without words. Thomas takes a seat briefly, resting his hands against the surface of the table. The wood feels slightly warmer now, a subtle change from earlier. He looks around the room, noting the small shifts that have taken place since morning began. Margaret pauses for a moment, her hands still, as if considering the next task. Then she continues, her movements flowing naturally once more. The rhythm of the day is steady, unbroken by haste or distraction. Outside, a faint murmur of voices drifts past, closer this time than before. Someone passes near the cottage, their footsteps audible for a few moments before fading away. The village feels more active now, though still calm. The boy glances toward the sound, then back to the table, his curiosity balanced by the familiarity of his surroundings. He remains close, his small presence adding to the quiet life within the room. Thomas rises again, moving toward the tools in the corner. He selects one and begins a small repair, his hands working slowly but with precision. Each movement is careful, ensuring the tool remains strong and reliable. Margaret continues her work, occasionally glancing toward him, then back to her task. There is a quiet coordination between them, an understanding that does not require speech. The fire continues to burn steadily, its warmth now a constant presence. The crackling sound becomes part of the background, blending with the soft movements and faint sounds from outside. The boy returns to the hearth, sitting once more near the flames. He watches them quietly, his body relaxed, his breathing steady. The warmth surrounds him, creating a small space of comfort within the larger room. Outside, the sun reaches higher still, brightening the village and revealing more detail in every surface. The morning has fully taken hold, though the day is still young. Inside, the cottage remains a place of quiet preparation and steady activity. Each task, each movement, contributes to the rhythm that carries them forward. Thomas finishes his small repair and sets the tool aside, satisfied with his work. He looks toward Margaret and the boy, his gaze calm and steady. Margaret pauses again, then lifts another item from the table, continuing her careful routine. The boy remains near the fire, his attention steady and quiet. The steady warmth of the cottage settles deeper now, softening the edges of the morning and making each movement feel less strained. The fire has grown into a reliable presence, its glow consistent and comforting, casting gentle light across the wooden beams above. Thomas stands quietly near the table, his hands resting for a moment as if measuring the pace of the day. Margaret continues her routine with calm precision, while the boy remains close to the hearth, his attention drifting between the fire and the quiet activity around him. A faint shift in light near the doorway suggests the sun climbing higher outside, its brightness pressing gently against the closed wood. The cottage feels more enclosed now, almost insulated from the world beyond, even though the cold still lingers just outside the walls. Thomas glances briefly toward the door, then back to the room, choosing once again to remain within this pocket of warmth for a little longer. Margaret gathers a few small items from the table and begins arranging them in a more orderly way, as though preparing for the next stage of the day. Her movements are unhurried, each one flowing into the next with a quiet sense of purpose. The boy watches her for a moment, then shifts his gaze back to the fire, mesmerized by the way the flames move and change without ever stopping. The sound of the firewood settling draws Thomas's attention, and he steps closer to the hearth. He nudges one of the logs slightly, ensuring it burns evenly, then straightens again. The warmth rises toward him, easing the stiffness that still lingers in his hands and arms from the cold morning outside. Outside, the village continues its slow and steady rhythm, though the sounds remain distant and softened by the walls. Occasionally, a faint echo of movement or a muffled voice drifts through, reminding them that they are part of a larger world. Inside, however, the pace remains calm and contained. Margaret lifts the pot once more, checking the warmth of the water before setting it aside again. A light trail of steam curls upward, disappearing almost instantly. She pauses for a brief moment, her hands resting against the edge of the table, as if considering what should come next. The boy rises slowly from his place near the fire and walks toward her, his steps small but steady. He looks up at the table, observing the items arranged there, then glances back at Margaret. There is a quiet question in his eyes, though he does not speak it aloud. Thomas notices the movement and shifts his position slightly, watching them both. There is a calm awareness in his expression, a sense that these small interactions carry their own importance within the rhythm of the day. Margaret gives the boy a gentle gesture, guiding him to stand beside her rather than directly in the way. Her hand rests briefly on his shoulder, steady and reassuring, before she returns to her task. The boy remains still, observing closely. The fire crackles again, louder this time, as a piece of wood shifts and settles deeper into the flames. A brief burst of sparks rises and fades, leaving behind a stronger, more even glow. The warmth spreads further, filling the room more completely. Thomas moves back toward the tools, selecting another item that needs attention. He begins working on it quietly, his hands moving with practiced precision. The small, repetitive motions create a rhythm that blends with the rest of the room's activity. Margaret adjusts the items on the table once more, then steps away, giving the boy a clearer view. He leans forward slightly, studying the objects with curiosity, his attention focused and steady. Outside, the light grows brighter still, casting stronger illumination through the small gaps in the cottage walls. The shift is subtle but noticeable, bringing a clearer sense of time passing. Thomas pauses in his work for a moment, flexing his fingers slightly before continuing. The warmth has made the movements easier, though the memory of the cold remains in the stiffness of his joints. Margaret walks toward the hearth and kneels briefly, adding a smaller piece of wood to the fire. She watches as it catches, ensuring the flame remains steady, then rises again. The fire responds with a soft, steady glow. The boy returns to his place near the hearth, sitting down once more with a quiet sense of contentment. He stretches his hands toward the warmth, then relaxes, his posture easing. The room feels balanced now, warmth, light, and quiet activity, all settled into a steady rhythm. Nothing feels rushed, nothing feels uncertain, even though the outside world remains cold and demanding. Thomas sets the tool aside, satisfied with the progress he has made. He looks around the room, taking in the small details, the arrangement of items, the steady fire, the calm presence of his family. Margaret returns to the table and begins preparing the next small task, her movements smooth and practiced. The boy watches the fire, occasionally glancing toward her, his attention shifting gently between the two. Outside, the village continues its quiet work, the sounds faint but constant. The day has fully begun, though it carries none of the urgency found in other times or places. Inside, the cottage remains a place of steady motion and quiet purpose. Each action flows naturally into the next, forming a continuous rhythm that carries them forward. Thomas steps closer to the doorway once more, resting his hand against it briefly. This time, he does not open it, choosing instead to remain within the warmth just a little longer. Margaret pauses again, her hands still for a moment, then resumes her work. The boy remains near the fire, his small form relaxed and calm. The cottage settles into a deeper kind of calm as the morning fully takes hold outside, the light now steady and pale against the winter sky. Inside, the fire has become the center of everything again, its steady crackle shaping the rhythm of the room. Thomas stands near the doorway for a moment longer, then slowly turns back toward the interior, choosing warmth over the sharp reminder of the cold outside. Margaret continues her careful tasks without interruption, her movements smooth and practiced, while the boy remains close to the hearth, comforted by its steady heat. A faint breeze slips through the small gaps in the walls, barely noticeable, but enough to remind them of the season beyond their shelter. It moves across the floor and fades quickly, swallowed by the fire's warmth. Thomas pauses as it passes, then resumes his slow, deliberate movement toward the table. Life inside the cottage continues without pause, shaped by habit more than urgency. Margaret lifts a small bundle of cloth and begins folding it again, even though it was already neatly arranged earlier. The repetition is part of the routine, a way of keeping order in a world where nothing outside can be controlled. Each fold is precise, her hands moving with quiet confidence. The boy watches her briefly, then turns his attention back to the fire, as if deciding where his curiosity belongs. Thomas picks up a wooden tool and inspects it under the shifting light. The daylight streaming in through the doorway has grown stronger, revealing more detail in every surface. He turns the tool slowly in his hands, checking for wear, then sets it down again with care. Everything in this place has a purpose, and everything must be maintained. Outside, faint movement continues across the village, though it remains distant and muted. A figure passes along the path, carrying something small and bundled, their breath visible in the cold air. Another cottage door opens briefly, letting out a small cloud of warmth before closing again. The world beyond remains active, but never rushed. Margaret moves toward the hearth once more, adjusting the fire with a practiced motion. She shifts one of the logs slightly, ensuring the heat spreads evenly through the room. The flames respond immediately, brightening just a little, casting a warmer glow across the wooden walls. The boy leans forward slightly, drawn again to the flickering light. Thomas steps closer to the table and sits for a moment, resting his hands. The stiffness from the cold is still present, but it has softened under the influence of warmth. He exhales slowly, watching the small movements of his family with quiet attention. There is no need for words here. Everything is understood through action. Margaret places the folded cloth aside and reaches for another small item, continuing her routine without hesitation. The boy shifts closer to her side, standing now rather than sitting, observing each step she takes. His presence is quiet but attentive, absorbing the flow of the morning around him. The fire pops softly again, a small sound that briefly fills the room before fading back into its steady rhythm. A few sparks rise and disappear into the air. The warmth now feels stable, no longer fragile like it was earlier in the morning. It holds the room gently, allowing movement to feel easier. Thomas stands again and moves toward the tools in the corner, selecting another object that requires attention. He begins working slowly, his focus steady and unbroken. Each motion is deliberate, shaped by long experience rather than thought. The sound of his work blends with the fire, forming a quiet background to the morning. Margaret pauses for a moment and looks toward him, then back at the table. She adjusts a small container, placing it slightly to one side, as if preparing space for later tasks. Her movements remain calm, never hurried, always controlled. The boy mirrors her stillness for a moment before shifting again. Outside, the sun rises higher, though still pale in color. Its light spreads across the village, softening the sharp contrast of shadows on the ground. The frost is slowly retreating, leaving behind damp patches that darken the earth. The air remains cold, but no longer harsh. Inside, the cottage feels more settled now, as if fully awake alongside its occupants. The fire continues to burn steadily, anchoring everything within the room. Thomas works quietly. Margaret organizes the space, and the boy moves between them, guided by curiosity and comfort. Margaret steps away from the table and approaches the hearth again, briefly warming her hands before returning to her task. The heat has become familiar now, no longer something that demands attention, but something that simply exists. She glances toward the boy, ensuring he remains close and safe. The boy looks back at her, then turns again toward the fire, his attention shifting between comfort and curiosity. He adjusts his position slightly, settling into a more relaxed posture near the warmth. His breathing is steady, his movements calm. Thomas finishes the small repair he was working on and sets the tool down carefully. He studies it for a moment, then nods slightly, satisfied. There is always something to fix, something to prepare, even in moments of stillness. Margaret returns to the table and begins arranging the next set of items, her routine continuing without interruption. The cottage feels balanced now, each person moving within their role naturally and without hesitation. The boy stands and walks a few steps toward Thomas, watching him closely as he puts the tool away. There is curiosity in his gaze, but also comfort in the familiarity of these actions. He is learning through observation, even without instruction. Thomas notices him and pauses briefly, then returns a small, quiet glance before continuing. It is a simple exchange, but one that carries understanding without needing words. The boy seems satisfied and returns to his place near the hearth. The fire remains steady, its glow filling the room with warmth and light. Outside, the village continues its quiet movement, while inside the cottage, the morning settles fully into rhythm. The winter morning outside continues to mature slowly, the pale sky now holding a steadier brightness that spreads evenly across the village. Inside the cottage, the warmth has become constant, no longer a fragile comfort, but a stable presence that fills every corner of the room. Thomas finishes his quiet work and places the tool back in its place, his movements slower now, as if the urgency of earlier hours has softened. Margaret continues her careful organizing, each item finding its place with quiet precision. The boy remains near the hearth, his attention resting comfortably on the steady fire that now feels like the center of the world. A subtle shift in the air inside the cottage signals the difference between morning's cold edge and midday's softer tone. The fire burns with a stronger rhythm now, its flames rising higher and more confidently as fresh wood feeds it. The room feels less divided between warmth and chill, more unified in a gentle, livable balance. Thomas stretches his hands slightly, flexing his fingers as the stiffness fades further. Margaret pauses for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the fire and the distant, muted sounds of the village beyond the walls. Outside, faint movement continues along the narrow paths, though it feels less restrained than earlier in the morning. Figures pass more frequently now, some carrying tools, others bundles of supplies. The frost on the ground has softened into a damp sheen, reflecting the growing light in broken, uneven patterns. The village feels awake in a fuller sense, no longer emerging, but actively moving forward in its daily rhythm. Inside, Margaret begins preparing a small, simple task that requires both hands and patience. Her movements are steady, never rushed, as she works near the table where everything is kept within reach. The boy shifts slightly, watching her again with renewed interest, as if drawn by the quiet repetition of familiar actions. There is something comforting in watching tasks unfold without noise or urgency. Thomas moves toward the fire once more, adjusting a log that has shifted slightly. The flames respond instantly, flickering brighter for a moment before settling again into a steady burn. He watches the fire for a brief moment longer, then turns away, satisfied that it will hold for some time. The fire has become something more than warmth. It is a constant presence that shapes the entire room. Margaret finishes her small task and places the item carefully aside. She looks toward Thomas briefly, then toward the boy, her expression calm and composed. There is no need for instruction or discussion. Their rhythm is shared and understood. Each person knows what must be done, even without words guiding them. The boy stands and takes a few small steps toward the table, then stops, as if deciding whether to continue. He glances back at the fire, then at Margaret, as though weighing where he is most needed or most drawn. Eventually, he settles near the edge of the hearth again, preferring the warmth over movement. His small presence adds a quiet liveliness to the otherwise steady room. Thomas sits again, this time for a longer pause, letting the warmth fully reach him. The tension that had lingered from the night and early morning has now almost completely faded. He leans slightly forward, resting his forearms on his knees, watching the steady motion of his family and the fire. There is a sense of calm structure in everything around him, even in the simplest actions. Margaret moves toward a small shelf and rearranges a few stored items, ensuring everything is properly placed. Her attention to detail is constant, a reflection of life where small preparations often determine comfort later. She steps back once satisfied, her gaze briefly scanning the room before returning to the table. The cottage feels orderly, each object aligned with purpose. Outside, the village's activity becomes more visible through the faint light filtering in. A group of villagers can be seen gathering near a central area, their movements coordinated but unhurried. The sounds of work, wood being handled, footsteps on softened frost drift in and out of hearing. It is a rhythm that repeats across the entire settlement, individual tasks forming a larger pattern. Inside, the fire continues its steady presence, now fully established for the day. The heat it produces spreads evenly, allowing the cottage to maintain a consistent warmth that no longer demands attention. Thomas rises again, this time moving toward the doorway with less hesitation. He opens it slightly, letting a narrow stream of cooler air enter before closing it again. The brief exchange with the outside world is enough to remind them of the difference between inside and out. The cold remains present beyond the walls, but it feels distant now, separated by the steady fire and enclosed space. Thomas returns to the center of the room, his movements calm and unhurried. Margaret glances toward the boy, then gestures gently for him to move a little closer to the table. He complies without resistance, settling near her again. There is a quiet comfort in proximity, in remaining within the shared space of activity and warmth. Each of them occupies their place naturally, without disruption. The fire emits a soft crackle, shifting as another log settles into place. A few glowing embers lift briefly into the air before fading. The sound is small, but fills the quiet moments between actions. It becomes part of the room's rhythm, just like breathing or movement. Thomas returns to a small task near the wall, adjusting an item that had been left slightly out of place. His attention to detail remains steady, even in moments of rest. Margaret continues her organizing, occasionally pausing to check the fire or glance toward the boy. The boy remains mostly still now, observing quietly, no longer shifting as much between curiosity and rest. Outside, the light continues to strengthen, though it no longer changes the mood of the village as dramatically as earlier. It simply becomes part of the environment, steady and consistent. The frost continues to fade in shaded areas, leaving behind a damp, earthy texture on the ground. Inside, the cottage feels fully settled into the day. The fire, the light, and the quiet movement of its occupants form a stable, continuous rhythm. There is no urgency, no interruption, only a steady flow of simple actions that define the passage of time. The afternoon settles more firmly over the village, and the light outside grows softer, losing the sharpness it had in the early morning. Inside the cottage, the fire continues to burn steadily, its warmth now fully established and no longer something that needs careful attention every moment. Thomas stands near the wall for a while, resting his hands as he watches the quiet order of the room. Margaret remains at the table, her movements slower now, as if the urgency of earlier tasks has eased. The boy sits close to the hearth, leaning slightly toward the flames with a calm, steady focus. A faint shift in sound outside suggests the village has moved into its deeper working hours. The earlier morning activity has turned into a more stable rhythm, where tasks are repeated rather than initiated. Occasionally, the distant sound of wood being split or carried drifts through the air, softened by distance and the cottage walls. Inside, however, everything remains contained, warm and steady. Thomas eventually moves away from the wall and returns to the table, taking a moment to rest his hands on its surface. The wood feels warm now, having absorbed heat from the fire over time. He looks at Margaret briefly, then toward the boy, acknowledging their shared quiet without speaking. The silence between them is not empty, but full of understanding built through repetition and routine. Margaret lifts a small container and checks its contents again, though nothing has changed since the last time she looked. The action is more about habit than necessity, a way of maintaining structure in the flow of the day. She sets it down gently, then adjusts another item nearby. Her focus remains calm and unwavering. The boy shifts slightly, changing his position closer to the fire, then stops once he finds a comfortable spot. His attention drifts between the flames and the small movements of his parents. There is a quiet curiosity in his expression, but also a growing sense of ease, as if the day has now fully settled around him. Thomas leans forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table again. His breathing is steady, and the earlier stiffness in his body has almost completely faded. He watches the fire for a moment, then glances toward the doorway, where the light outside appears softer and more diffused than before. Margaret pauses and follows his glance, though she does not move toward the door. Instead, she remains where she is, grounded in the familiar interior of the cottage. The outside world feels distant at this hour, present but not pressing. The warmth inside creates a boundary that feels stable and reassuring. A soft crackle from the fire draws attention back to the center of the room. One of the logs shifts slightly, releasing a brief glow of brighter flame before settling again. The sound is small but noticeable in the otherwise quiet space. It serves as a reminder of the constant life within the hearth. The boy leans forward a little more, watching the shifting light with steady focus. The flames move in patterns that feel almost alive to him, changing constantly without repeating exactly. He remains silent, absorbed in the simple motion of fire and light. Thomas stands again and walks slowly toward the corner where a few stored items are kept. He checks them briefly, adjusting one or two objects without urgency. Each movement is deliberate but relaxed, reflecting a moment where immediate demands are absent. The day has entered a steady middle phase where maintenance replaces action. Margaret moves to the hearth once more, not to adjust anything urgently, but simply to observe. She watches the fire for a moment, then steps back, satisfied with its stability. The warmth fills the room evenly now, making it easier for everyone to remain comfortable without constant adjustment. Outside, the sky continues its slow transition toward a softer tone, suggesting that the afternoon is deepening further. Shadows grow slightly longer, though still gentle and diffuse. The village maintains its steady rhythm, neither rushing nor pausing, but continuing in quiet balance. Inside, Thomas returns to the table and sits again, this time with a more relaxed posture. His hands rest loosely, and his gaze moves calmly between Margaret and the boy. There is a sense of completeness in the room, as if everything needed for this moment is already in place. Margaret takes a small step toward the boy and adjusts his position slightly, ensuring he remains warm and comfortable near the fire. The boy accepts the adjustment without resistance, his attention never fully leaving the flames. The warmth continues to hold him in place, both physically and mentally. The fire emits another soft crackle, followed by a steady, even glow that fills the room. The sound blends into the background, becoming part of the cottage's natural rhythm. No one reacts to it now. It has become expected, constant, reassuring. Thomas glances toward Margaret again, then toward the boy, and finally back to the fire. The sequence of his gaze reflects a quiet awareness of everything within the room. Nothing demands attention urgently, yet everything remains within his awareness. Margaret resumes a small task at the table, moving items slightly to one side and then another, as if refining their arrangement. Her actions are subtle, almost meditative in their repetition. The boy watches her briefly, then returns to the fire once more. The cottage remains filled with steady warmth, and the contrast with the cold outside feels distant now, almost abstract. The walls hold the heat securely, allowing the family to exist within a stable, quiet environment. Time passes gently, marked only by small changes in light and sound. Thomas shifts his position slightly, stretching his shoulders before relaxing again. The physical ease of the afternoon settles more fully into him. There is no immediate need to act, only to remain present within the flow of the day. Margaret pauses, looking briefly toward the window, where a faint glow suggests the sun has begun its slow descent. The day is moving forward, though without urgency or disruption. She turns back to the table, continuing her quiet work. The boy remains near the fire, now fully relaxed, his posture calm and still. The flames continue their steady movement, providing a constant focal point in the room. His attention does not waver for long, but returns again and again to the warmth. The afternoon light outside begins to soften further, shifting toward a warmer, muted tone as the day slowly leans toward evening. Inside the cottage, the fire remains steady, its flames lower than before, but still strong enough to hold the room in a comfortable warmth. Thomas sits quietly at the table, his posture relaxed now, as if the weight of the day has settled into something manageable. Margaret continues small, careful tasks without urgency, her movements flowing in a familiar rhythm. The boy stays close to the hearth, his presence calm and still, almost blending into the steady glow of the fire. A faint change in the air suggests the outside temperature is beginning to drop again, as it often does before evening fully arrives. The warmth inside the cottage becomes more noticeable in contrast, creating a gentle boundary between shelter and the cold world beyond. Thomas notices this shift and glances briefly toward the door, then returns his attention to the room without comment. Life inside continues in its quiet, balanced state. Margaret pauses her work for a moment, resting her hands lightly on the edge of the table. She looks toward the fire, then toward the boy, checking silently that all remains as it should. There is a sense of completion in the earlier tasks, but also the awareness that the day is not yet finished. She exhales softly and resumes her slow, careful movements. The boy adjusts his position near the hearth, leaning slightly closer to the warmth. The fire's glow reflects softly in his eyes, giving the space around him a steady, comforting presence. He remains quiet, absorbed in the movement of the flames, as if the fire itself is telling a story only he can follow. Thomas stands and stretches his arms slightly, easing the stiffness that has returned from sitting too long. He walks toward the corner where tools and small items are kept, checking them again out of habit more than necessity. Everything appears in order, yet he still examines each piece briefly before stepping back. Outside, the village continues its slow rhythm, though the activity has become less intense than earlier in the day. Figures move along the paths at a more relaxed pace, their tasks shifting toward completion rather than beginning. Smoke from chimneys rises more steadily now, blending into the dimming sky above. Margaret returns to a small bundle of cloth and begins folding it once more, even though it is already neatly arranged. The repetition is part of her rhythm, a way of keeping the space orderly as the day progresses. Each fold is smooth and precise, her attention steady and calm. The fire gives a soft crackle, and a small burst of light briefly brightens the room before settling again. The sound is familiar and comforting, blending into the background of the cottage's quiet life. The boy glances toward it, then returns to his still observation. Thomas moves back toward the table and rests his hands on its surface, looking across the room. There is a sense of stillness now that feels different from the morning, less about preparation and more about presence. The day has reached a point where everything feels settled into place. Margaret finishes her folding and sets the cloth aside, then briefly adjusts a few items near the table. Her movements are small, almost invisible in their subtlety, but they maintain the quiet order of the space. She pauses again, looking toward the fire and then toward Thomas. The boy shifts slightly, then sits upright for a moment before relaxing again near the hearth. His attention moves between the fire and the quiet movements of the adults, though neither demands his focus fully. He remains in a calm, observational state, comfortable in the warmth. Outside, the light continues to fade slowly, not abruptly, but in a gradual descent that softens the edges of everything it touches. The village takes on a quieter appearance, as if preparing itself for the coming evening. Movement outside becomes less frequent, though still present. Inside, Thomas takes a slow step toward the fire, standing near it for a moment. The warmth rises gently toward him, easing the last remnants of cold that still linger from earlier. He watches the flames without moving, allowing himself a brief pause. Margaret gathers another small item from the table and sets it aside, completing another part of her routine. She glances briefly toward the boy, then toward Thomas, ensuring both remain comfortable and settled. The room feels stable, balanced, and quiet. The fire burns steadily, its light now more golden than bright, casting softer shadows across the walls. The sound of burning wood becomes more noticeable as the room grows quieter. Each crackle feels spaced, deliberate, almost like punctuation in the stillness. The boy leans back slightly, resting his hands on the floor beside him. His breathing is even, his posture relaxed. The warmth has created a sense of comfort that holds him in place, making movement unnecessary. Thomas returns to the table and sits again, this time more fully relaxed than before. His gaze moves slowly across the room, taking in the quiet order of everything. There is no task demanding immediate attention, only the continuation of the day. Margaret steps closer to the hearth once more, not to adjust it, but simply to feel its warmth. She pauses there for a moment, then steps back again, satisfied. The fire continues to hold its steady rhythm. Outside, the sky deepens further into evening tones, though the sun has not yet fully disappeared. Shadows lengthen across the village paths, and the air grows cooler again. The transition is gentle but clear. Inside, the cottage remains unchanged in its calm state. The warmth holds steady, the fire continues to glow, and the three figures remain within their familiar positions. There is a sense that nothing needs to be added or removed. The boy shifts slightly, then settles once more, his attention finally resting fully on the fire. Margaret resumes a quiet adjustment of items on the table, and Thomas remains seated, watching without urgency. The evening light outside deepens into a muted gray-blue, signaling the slow arrival of night across the village once again. Inside the cottage, the fire has become the dominant source of warmth and light, its steady glow casting soft shadows along the wooden walls. Thomas remains seated at the table, his posture relaxed but alert, as if naturally attuned to the gradual shift of the day. Margaret continues her quiet preparations, her movements slower now, almost blending into the rhythm of the fatting afternoon. The boy stays close to the hearth, his small figure framed by the fire's gentle, flickering light. A slight chill begins to press more noticeably against the cottage walls, reminding them that evening cold is approaching once again. The fire responds by crackling a little more firmly, as if resisting the outside temperature. Thomas glances toward the doorway for a brief moment, then returns his attention inward, choosing the comfort of the room over the growing cold beyond. The transition from day to evening feels slow and natural, without urgency or disruption. Margaret pauses her work and looks across the room, taking in the quiet balance of their small space. Everything appears in order, and nothing demands immediate attention. She adjusts her shawl slightly around her shoulders, then moves a small object on the table a few inches to the side, maintaining her habitual sense of structure. Even in stillness, she remains gently active, always preparing in subtle ways. The boy shifts closer to the hearth, feeling the warmth intensify as the fire settles into its evening rhythm. His attention remains fixed on the flames, which now move in slower, deeper patterns compared to earlier in the day. The fire has become more than heat. It is light, comfort, and a steady presence that anchors the room. He sits quietly, fully absorbed in its movement. Thomas rises slowly from the table and stretches again, easing the stiffness that returns with prolonged stillness. He moves toward the corner where tools and supplies are kept, checking them once more in the fatting light. His actions remain careful and deliberate, though there is no immediate task requiring urgency. It is simply part of his steady awareness of the household. Outside, the village begins to quiet further as the day edges toward night. Fewer figures move along the paths now, and the earlier sounds of work have softened into distant echoes. Smoke rises steadily from chimneys, drifting upward into the darkening sky. The entire settlement seems to settle into a shared rhythm of rest and preparation for night. Margaret returns to the hearth and adds a small piece of wood to the fire. The flames respond immediately, brightening for a moment before returning to a steady glow. She watches carefully to ensure it burns evenly, then steps back again. The fire's sound becomes slightly richer, filling the quiet space of the cottage. Thomas returns to the table and sits again, this time leaning back slightly in a more relaxed posture. His gaze moves slowly across the room, resting briefly on each member of his family. There is a quiet sense of completion in the way the day has unfolded, even though night has not fully arrived yet. The boy adjusts his position again, now sitting with his knees drawn slightly closer to his body. The warmth from the fire wraps around him comfortably, reducing the tension of the colder air near the floor. He remains silent, content to simply observe and exist within the steady warmth of the room. Margaret folds another small piece of cloth and places it aside with care, continuing her evening routine. Her actions are slower now, more reflective than earlier in the day. Each movement feels like a gentle closing of tasks rather than the beginning of new ones. The cottage feels orderly and calm under her care. The fire crackles again, sending a brief flicker of light across the ceiling beams. Shadows shift gently and then settle once more. The sound is soft but grounding, marking the passage of time in a subtle, continuous way. No one reacts to it. It has become part of the room's language. Thomas stands once more and walks toward the doorway, pausing just before opening it. He listens for a moment to the outside world, where the wind has begun to pick up slightly. Then, after a brief pause, he opens the door just enough to feel the cold air rush in before closing it again. The contrast reinforces the safety of the cottage interior. Margaret glances toward him, then back to the table, continuing her quiet organization. The boy watches the brief movement at the door, then returns his attention to the fire without hesitation. The moment passes quickly, becoming part of the evening's steady rhythm. Outside, the sky darkens further, shifting toward deeper shades of blue and gray. The last traces of daylight fade gradually, replaced by the soft emergence of night. The village becomes quieter still, as if the entire landscape is lowering its voice. Inside, the fire holds steady, its light now the primary presence in the room. The warmth it provides feels more important as the temperature outside continues to drop. Thomas returns to the table and remains seated, his movements minimal and calm. Margaret steps away from her tasks and stands near the hearth for a moment, simply watching the fire. There is a quiet stillness in her posture, as if acknowledging the end of the day's labor. After a brief pause, she returns to the table again. The boy leans slightly forward, then relaxes back once more, fully settled in his place. His breathing is even, his posture loose, reflecting the comfort of the warm environment. The firelight dances softly across his face, giving the room a gentle sense of life. Thomas looks toward Margaret and the boy again, then allows his gaze to rest on the fire. The evening has fully taken hold now, and the cottage feels enclosed in warmth and quiet stability. There is no need for movement beyond what is necessary. Margaret makes one final adjustment to the items on the table, then steps back, her work for the moment complete. She stands quietly, observing the room, before sitting down again. Everything feels settled into place. The fire continues its steady rhythm, neither growing nor fading, simply maintaining its presence. Outside, The night prepares to fully arrive, but inside the cottage, warmth and quiet persist. The night finally settles over the village in full, wrapping everything outside in a deep, quiet darkness that feels heavier than the evening before it. Inside the cottage, the fire remains strong and steady, now the only source of warmth and light shaping the room. Thomas sits at the table in a calm, resting posture, his day's movement finally giving way to stillness. Margaret has finished her small evening tasks and now sits quietly, her attention occasionally drifting toward the fire. The boy remains closest to the hearth, fully comforted by its steady glow as the night continues to deepen. A soft wind moves across the outside walls, brushing against the cottage with a low, distant sound that never fully enters the room. The wooden structure holds firm, keeping the cold firmly outside where it belongs. Inside, the warmth feels more concentrated now, almost protective, as the fire burns with a slow, even rhythm. Thomas listens briefly to the wind, then relaxes again, finding reassurance in the stability of the walls around him. Margaret adjusts her position slightly, pulling her shawl more comfortably around her shoulders as the temperature subtly drops outside. Her movements are unhurried, reflecting the end of the day's demands. She glances toward Thomas, then toward the boy, confirming silently that everything remains in order. The room feels settled, as if the entire day has folded neatly into this single, quiet moment. The boy shifts closer to the fire, leaning in just enough to feel its full warmth without discomfort. His attention remains fixed on the flames, which now move in slower, deeper patterns compared to earlier in the day. The firelight casts soft shadows across his face, giving the room a gentle sense of life, even in the stillness. He remains silent, completely absorbed in the steady movement of the fire. Thomas eventually stands from the table and stretches again, easing the last traces of stiffness from his body. He walks slowly toward the hearth, stopping just beside it to feel the heat more directly. The fire responds with a steady crackle, sending a brief wave of warmth upward. He watches it for a moment, then turns slightly as if confirming the room's stability. Outside, the village has grown almost entirely silent now, with only the occasional faint movement or distant sound breaking the stillness. The glow from other cottages appears as small, scattered points of light across the darkness. Each home mirrors the same pattern: firelight, quiet movement, and the slow settling of night. The entire village feels united in rest, even without direct interaction. Margaret rises slowly and moves toward the table, straightening a few items once more before sitting again. Her actions are minimal, almost symbolic now, as if closing the final chapter of the day's activity. She pauses briefly, then lets her hands rest in her lap. The quietness of the room feels complete, with nothing left demanding attention. The boy adjusts his posture again, now sitting in a more relaxed position, with his back slightly leaned toward the hearth. The warmth fully surrounds him, making the cold outside feel distant and irrelevant. His breathing is steady, his attention still loosely tied to the fire, though now more relaxed than focused. The comfort of the room holds him gently in place. Thomas returns to the table and sits down again, this time leaning slightly forward with his elbows resting on the surface. His gaze moves slowly across the room, taking in the small, familiar details of their surroundings. There is a sense of completion in his posture, as if the day has fully resolved itself into rest. He no longer feels the need to move unless necessary. Margaret looks toward the fire once more, watching it carefully as it maintains its steady glow. The flames shift slightly with each small movement of the wood, but remain consistent and controlled. She seems satisfied with its condition, then turns her attention back to the quiet interior of the cottage. Everything is in balance. A faint sound of shifting wood echoes softly as one of the logs settles deeper into the fire. The sound is brief, but noticeable in the otherwise complete silence. The fire brightens slightly for a moment, then returns to its steady rhythm. No one reacts. It is simply part of the night's ongoing presence. Thomas leans back again, allowing himself to rest more fully now that the day's work is entirely behind him. His hands rest loosely on the table, no longer engaged in any task. The warmth of the room has reached a comfortable stability, making stillness feel natural rather than idle. He breathes slowly, calm and steady. Margaret shifts slightly, then stands for a brief moment before sitting again near the table. The movement is small, almost reflexive, as if adjusting for comfort rather than purpose. She glances toward the boy and then toward Thomas, her expression calm and settled. The household feels complete in its quiet arrangement. The boy leans a little closer to the fire again, then settles back once more, finding a position that holds him comfortably in place. His attention drifts gently between the flames and the shadows they cast. The fire remains his constant point of focus, steady and reassuring in its presence. Outside, the wind increases slightly for a moment, brushing more firmly against the cottage walls before fading again. The sound passes without entering, leaving the interior untouched and calm. The contrast between inside and outside feels stronger now, reinforcing the sense of safety within the cottage. Thomas turns his head slightly toward the door, then returns his gaze to the fire without moving further. The night outside feels distant, almost separate from their enclosed world. Inside, everything is contained, warm, and still. Margaret finally relaxes into a more settled position, her movements slowing to near stillness. She watches the fire without needing to adjust it further. The boy remains in his place, calm and quiet, fully at ease in the warmth. The fire continues its steady burn, neither rising nor fading significantly, simply holding its presence as the center of the room. Shadows move gently along the walls, shifting with the flames, but never breaking the stillness. The night settles even deeper over the village, reaching a point where everything outside feels completely absorbed into darkness. Inside the cottage, the fire remains the only moving light, steady and dependable as it casts soft orange patterns across the walls. Thomas sits quietly at the table, no longer focused on tasks, simply existing in the calm after a long day. Margaret remains still near the hearth, her posture relaxed, as if fully accepting the stillness of the night. The boy stays closest to the fire, his small form almost motionless, comforted by its constant warmth. A faint shift in temperature outside presses gently against the cottage walls, but the structure holds firm without a sound. The wind moves in slow, distant waves, never strong enough to disturb the interior peace. Inside, the fire responds with a gentle crackle, maintaining its steady rhythm without interruption. Thomas listens briefly, then allows his attention to drift back into stillness. Margaret adjusts her shawl slightly, then lets her hands rest again in her lap. Her eyes remain on the fire, though her expression shows no urgency or concern. Everything that needed to be done has already been completed for the day. Now there is only waiting, resting, and the quiet passing of time. The boy shifts just a little closer to the hearth, then settles again, finding a position that feels completely comfortable. The firelight reflects softly in his eyes, creating a calm, almost hypnotic focus. He does not speak or move beyond small adjustments, fully absorbed in the steady glow. The warmth holds him in place like a gentle anchor. Thomas leans slightly back in his chair, letting his shoulders relax fully for the first time in hours. His breathing is slow and even, matching the rhythm of the quiet room. He glances once toward Margaret and the boy, then returns his gaze to the fire. There is a sense of completeness in the stillness surrounding them. Outside, the village remains quiet, with only the faintest hints of movement occasionally passing through the darkness. A soft glow from distant cottages marks where others are also resting or preparing for sleep. The entire settlement feels unified in silence, each household enclosed in its own pocket of warmth. The night is deep and uninterrupted. Margaret leans slightly forward, watching the fire as it shifts and reshapes itself with each small movement of wood. The flames rise and fall in a steady cycle, never growing too strong or too weak. She remains attentive but calm, as if simply observing something familiar and comforting. Her presence adds to the room's quiet balance. The boy briefly turns his head toward Thomas, then back to the fire, as if checking the space around him before settling again. His body remains relaxed, his movements slow and minimal. The warmth from the hearth surrounds him completely, making the cold outside feel distant and unreal. He is fully at ease now. Thomas shifts his hands on the table, resting them more comfortably as the night continues. He no longer thinks in terms of tasks or plans, only in the quiet passing of time. The firelight flickers across his face, softening his features into stillness. He remains present, but unburdened. Margaret stands for a moment, then takes a small step toward the table before stopping again. The movement is brief, almost instinctive, as if checking one last detail before fully resting. She then returns to her place near the hearth, satisfied that everything is in order. The room feels complete and undisturbed. The fire emits a slightly stronger crackle as another log settles into place. A brief burst of light brightens the room before fading back into a steady glow. No one reacts, as it has become part of the background rhythm of the night. The sound is familiar, expected, and calming. Thomas closes his eyes briefly, then opens them again, remaining in a state of quiet restfulness. He does not sleep yet, but he is no longer actively aware of time passing. The warmth of the room holds him in a comfortable stillness. Everything around him feels steady and secure. Margaret's gaze remains fixed on the fire, though her thoughts seem to drift into quiet reflection. Her posture is relaxed, no longer shaped by the tasks of the day. The firelight softens the edges of the room, giving everything a gentle, muted glow. The atmosphere is peaceful and contained. The boy adjusts his position once more, then becomes completely still, his attention fully absorbed by the fire. His breathing is slow and regular, reflecting a deep sense of comfort. The warmth has erased any lingering memory of the cold outside. He remains quietly content. Outside, the wind rises slightly again, brushing along the cottage walls before fading once more into silence. The sound never enters the room, only suggesting its presence beyond the wood. Inside, the fire continues its steady rhythm without change. The contrast between outside and inside remains clear and comforting. Thomas leans forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table once again, then relaxes back into stillness. There is no urgency in his movement, only quiet awareness of the space around him. The fire remains his primary focus, though even that feels secondary to rest. Margaret shifts her weight gently, then becomes still again, her attention fully at ease. The boy remains unchanged in his calm posture near the hearth. The three of them exist in the same quiet space, connected by warmth and silence. The fire continues its steady, unbroken burn, casting gentle light that moves slowly across the cottage interior. Shadows shift softly, but never disturb the peace of the room. Every element feels stable, balanced, and complete. The night reaches its deepest point now, where even the village outside feels completely swallowed by silence and darkness. Inside the cottage, the fire has settled into a calm, steady glow, no longer bright and active, but low and enduring like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. Thomas remains seated at the table, fully relaxed, his thoughts quiet and unhurried as the long day finally gives way to rest. Margaret sits near the hearth, Her posture softened, no longer shaped by tasks, but by stillness. The boy stays closest to the warmth, his body calm and motionless, fully embraced by the fire's steady presence. A faint, almost imperceptible wind passes outside, brushing against the wooden walls without disturbing anything inside. It is distant and harmless, more a reminder of the world beyond than an intrusion into their space. The cottage holds its warmth firmly, as if it has learned how to resist the night itself. Thomas barely reacts, only noticing it for a moment before returning to stillness. Margaret lowers her gaze slightly, watching the fire as it shifts in slow, gentle movements. The flames are smaller now, but stable, their light spreading softly across the room without flicker or urgency. She seems content with its condition, no longer needing to adjust or intervene. Everything feels settled in its place. The boy leans slightly against the edge of the hearth, then relaxes fully, almost as if the warmth has anchored him there. His breathing is slow and even, matching the quiet rhythm of the room. The firelight reflects faintly in his eyes, giving him a calm, distant look of complete ease. He remains absorbed in the stillness without effort. Thomas shifts his hands slightly on the table, then lets them rest again. His posture is fully relaxed now, shoulders lowered, body at ease after the long cycle of work and movement. There is no urgency left in him, only quiet awareness of the moment. The fire remains his only focus, steady and unchanged. Margaret adjusts her position subtly, then becomes still once more. She does not speak, nor does she need to. The silence between them feels natural, built from hours of shared presence rather than words. The cottage holds them together in a quiet balance. Outside, the village remains completely dark now, with only the faintest suggestion of distant life hidden within the night. No movement breaks the stillness in any noticeable way. The entire world beyond the cottage feels distant, almost forgotten in the depth of night. Inside, only the fire defines time and space. The fire gives a soft, steady crackle as a small piece of wood settles deeper into its embers. A brief glow rises and fades, casting shifting patterns across the ceiling before returning to calm. None of them react. It is simply part of the night's ongoing presence. The sound blends into the silence naturally. Thomas leans back slightly in his chair, allowing himself to rest even more fully. His eyes remain open, but his mind feels quiet and unburdened. The warmth of the room surrounds him completely, easing any remaining tension from the day. He no longer measures time, only presence. Margaret's gaze remains fixed on the fire, though her attention feels distant and reflective. She sits still, not thinking in urgency or planning, but in quiet acceptance of the night's completeness. The firelight softens her features, making everything feel calm and unbroken. She remains at peace. The boy shifts once more, then settles completely, his body now fully still. The fire's warmth holds him securely, removing any memory of the cold outside. His attention drifts into a soft, unfocused state, no longer observing, but simply existing in comfort. He is safe, warm, and quiet. Thomas glances briefly toward Margaret and the boy, then returns his gaze to the fire. The simple act carries no meaning beyond acknowledgement. Everything is already understood without need for words. The cottage holds them all in a shared stillness. Margaret exhales gently, then relaxes further into her seat. The sound is subtle, almost blending into the quiet of the room. There is no task remaining, no movement required. The night has completed its quiet cycle around them. The fire continues its slow, steady burn, neither growing nor diminishing significantly. Its light remains soft but constant, painting the room in warm, shifting tones. Shadows move gently, but never break the calm atmosphere. The room feels timeless in its stillness. Outside, the wind fades completely for a moment, leaving absolute silence beyond the walls. It feels as if the entire world has paused. Inside, nothing changes, and nothing needs to change. The cottage exists in perfect, quiet balance. Thomas closes his eyes briefly, then opens them again, remaining awake, but fully at rest. His breathing is slow and steady, perfectly aligned with the calm of the room. He no longer feels the weight of the day, only the comfort of its end. Margaret remains still, her posture unchanged, her attention resting quietly on the fire. The boy does not move at all now, fully settled into the warmth and silence. The three of them share the same quiet space without effort or thought. The fire gives one final soft crackle, then returns to its steady glow. It is neither strong nor weak, only present, like a quiet companion through the night. Nothing disturbs it, and nothing demands from it. And so, as the night reaches its deepest and final calm, the cottage remains warm, still, and safe, holding Thomas, Margaret, and the boy together in quiet unity as the long winter night finally completes its journey and the story comes gently to its end.